to do a deep dive or go down in the rabbit hole of discussing timing your hunts based off what direction your thermal hub that you're interested in, that you've scouted, that you found, uh, based off its direction. What kind of timing of a hunt would you want to throw at a hub like that, based off of the direction that that thermal hub is facing or draining into? A lot of times these thermal hubs are wind based in a lot of ways, um, but a lot of times they're just based more off of direction as far as your timing for your thermals. Wind can play a factor in when you'd want to hunt these different thermal hubs, um, but more than anything, the direction that that thermal hub is facing is going to dictate more about when you could hunt properly in a thermal hub like this, rather than the wind itself. So you're relying on the direction and the timing of those thermals based off that direction to try to build a plan to hunt an area like this. So we're going to do a deep dive into direction of thermal hubs and kind of go down a rabbit hole right here. So let me first start off by saying that not everybody's terrain and thermal hubs are going to look like these. These are just examples that I pull from across the country. So these range from anywhere in the southeast, the Midwest, to the northeast, to the east. I've got 4 different thermal hubs, and they come from 4 different areas within the country that are examples on here. So just take that in consideration. Also, there's been a lot of discussion about whether it's worth hunting in thermal hubs and things like that. And I can't say one way or the other. I like to use them. I only like to hunt them in strategic fashion. So, like throwing a hunt that I know is going to have a really good opportunity um, to kill a big buck or kill a mature buck or something like that. I don't hunt them religiously. I just use them to plan my other hunts off of because I know how these bucks use these thermal hubs. So, hunting a thermal hub is more about using the thermal hub, the movement within it, to try to get an advantage over a buck instead of just trying to throw a hunt down in a thermal hub just for the sake of doing it. So, let's go in and let's do a little bit of a discussion on the different parts of a thermal hub so you don't get confused when I start talking about them. So the head of a thermal hub is just that. It's the beginning, the higher elevation, the top of that thermal hub, or where that thermal hub begins. Now the bottom of the tail is just that. It's the end point, the ending of that thermal hub. When it no longer is a thermal hub, when it dumps into the a larger thermal hub or a creek bottom or something like that, we're going to refer to that as the bottom or the tail. So right here, I've added 3 different terms. I've added links, micro drainage, and secondary ridge points. Start off with secondary ridge points. These secondary ridge points are just that. They're secondary points that come off the main ridge, and usually within a thermal hub, you'll have multiple secondary ridge points within that thermal hub, and these can be really fantastic locations for secondary bedding or primary bedding locations within these thermal hubs. So don't forget that. Next up is a micro drainage. Your micro drainages are just that. They're small drainages that go up the side of these ridges. These are really good travel points. A lot of times bucks like to use these to traverse elevation, to get from the bottom of the thermal hub up to the top of the thermal hub and stay hidden. The third thing here on this page is links. Links are the land bridges or joining areas between thermal hubs. So if you have multiple thermal hubs that kind of meet on a ridge, one facing north, one facing south, east, west, north, whatever, where they link up or where those hollows or those drainages come up and meet each other, a lot of times it'll form a land bridge, and that's just a link. And a lot of times that's where mature bucks like cruise that rim of those links, especially during rut. So those links are important travel corridors. A lot of times in ridge systems, you'll have those links that'll be down in a saddle or something like that. But if you have plateau top ridge tops, a lot of times it can just be a lowering of the elevation at a certain point where those thermal hubs meet. Now, the fourth feature on here is a micro hub. And these are really important little features. A lot of times these can be staging locations or even bedding locations for bucks if they're cruising up and down these thermal hubs. or up on the ridge points, they can drop down in these micro hubs and bed. And a lot of times, if you're in an area where you got forested timber, where you've had timber harvest, these micro hubs can be tucked back into that forested area, into that harvested area, and the SMZ portion, the streamside management zone, can form your thermal hub. And these are the areas where you get a lot of scattered larger hardwoods, mass producing hardwoods, mixed with just really thick and nasty underbrush. So these tend to be areas that bucks hide out in, areas like that, and they're really important to identify. I love to drop cameras around these micro hubs, and that's where I see a lot of that early movement. Once that thermal switch hits, is down into these micro hubs. So now let's talk about these hub directions, and we're going to talk about probably my favorite hub direction to find, and that's an east-facing hub. East-facing hubs in the evening seem to have the jump start or begin their thermal switch earlier than any other thermal hub. They're the most consistent as far as timing goes on that thermal switch. East facing thermal hubs are one of the only thermal hubs that I'll actually get down in the bottom of the hub and attempt to hunt. The reason being is just wind flow and thermal switch. I can count on that thermal switch in these east facing thermal hubs to be pretty consistent. So it's just about timing, it's about confidence, it's about knowing when that thermal switch within that thermal hub kicks off, and you're just trying to get down in that bottom of that thermal hub and maybe try to find the exit where that buck is exiting that thermal hub and working back in the ridges above it, whether it be coming out of the south or north. A lot of times those bucks will stay up in the head of those thermal hubs, those east facing thermal hubs, in the evening, and they'll work their way down in the bottom, trying to gather up as much information as possible within that thermal hub. Once that switch hits, they're trying to work their way down so you can take advantage of that more often in an east-facing thermal hub. Another issue is east-facing thermal hubs are not as affected by wind as other thermal hubs. A north wind, a south wind, a northwest, a southwest wind usually won't affect whether these east-facing thermal hubs are experiencing movement by mature bucks or bucks in general. They're just bulletproof almost when it comes to wind direction. The only wind direction that you really have to be concerned about is an east-facing wind, a wind that's blowing into the thermal hub. And east winds are not as common during hunting season, except on just certain periods of time. And those times tend to suppress movement anyway. So if I have an east wind, I'm not going to approach an east-facing thermal hub. I'm just going to leave it out. But if it has a north, northwest, northeast, south, southwest, southeast wind, I feel pretty confident I can use that wind within that thermal hub to generate movement, knowing that thermal switch is probably going to be strong enough to overpower any winds or any swirling winds. Now, I'm not going to push up into the thermal hub. Let me state that again. You do not push up in to the head or up near the head of these thermal hubs. You're trying to stay at a point where you go undetected and that buck is dropping down to you, trying to take advantage of that thermal. So I'm not saying push up in these thermal hubs and hunt. You have to do a lot of due diligence, a lot of boots on the ground, a lot of camera scouting to figure out where that buck is most susceptible to you ambushing him. Now we're going to move on to the west-facing thermal hubs. West-facing thermal hubs tend to be your opportunity to throw a morning hunt at a west-facing thermal hub. These tend to generate a lot of movement in that early morning and mid-morning period, especially during that immediate pre-rut, just before the rut kicks off, and during the rut. West-facing thermal hubs tend to generate a lot of upward movement, meaning the bucks are starting at the bottom or the tail of the thermal hub and working their way up through that thermal hub. And they may move through multiple locations. So you can have a buck that moves up the middle of this thermal hub and works his way up a secondary or a micro thermal or a micro draw or a micro drainage or one of these other drainages and flip a ridge, drop back down in that thermal hub. A lot of times, these bucks that I've noticed on my trail camera data, they will work up into these west-facing thermal hubs, and they may spend all morning just bouncing around the little different thermal features within that thermal hub. And a lot of times they'll bed mid-morning somewhere on a secondary ridge point inside that thermal hub. One of the interesting things about these west-facing thermal hubs is the amount of sign that you can find along that bottom or tail end. And a lot of times during the peak of the rut, these west-facing thermals, if you can get a multiple ones that dump out into a larger creek bottom, you can get a lot of cruising action along that that bottom of that tail end. Those bucks will run those ridges above the thermal hub and drop down in that bottom of that tail end of those multiple west-facing ridges into that larger creek bottom, and they'll cruise up and down, especially in that mid-morning time frame. They're trying to get all that scent that's still funneling down in that thermal hub. If a doe has worked her way up in that thermal hub at some point in time, he can get that scent information and he can go cut a track and try to chase her down. So rut time period, the bottom or tail end of these west-facing thermal hubs can be dynamite spots to just intercept a buck that's up on his feet cruising, looking for doe or looking for the scent that's being washed out of that west-facing thermal hub. So these west-facing thermal hubs, that's your opportunity to hunt a thermal hub in the morning. You're trying to utilize the fact that that buck is working his way out of that bottom, using that drop-in thermal that hadn't switched in that west-facing thermal yet. The sun hadn't warmed it up yet, so it's going to keep those thermals dropping way up into the morning, and you got to utilize that knowledge to hunt around these west-facing thermal hubs in the morning. I'm not going to push up into the bottom of that thermal hub. I'm not going to walk down into that thermal hub from the east or anything like that. I'm going to stay up on those ridges and try to position myself where my thermals are not dropping into a point that that buck's going to be crossing into. So you got to play a strategic game. You got to keep in mind in these west-facing thermals, these bucks are trying to move up in elevation. They're trying to get into areas, secondary ridge points, things like that, in these west-facing thermals to bed up in that mid-morning, early morning time frame. So these are good ambush locations to sit up above those areas and let that buck work his way into that falling thermal, and you're position yourself where your thermals, where the scent that you're dispersing is dropping off in a different area, and he has no clue you're there. So it's just a strategic type of game you're trying to play in these west-facing thermals, trying to hunt them in that morning time period. So now we move over to north-facing thermal. And north-facing thermals tend to be really good locations early season before the rut kicks in. The reason being, during that early season, you're dealing with a lot of warm weather, hot temperatures, humidity, things like that. And these north-facing thermal hubs tend to hold cooler. A lot of them have got lush vegetation growing in them. You're going to have moss, you're going to have ferns, you're going to have mushrooms, things the deer are going to want to eat. Usually, north-facing thermal hubs hold their moisture value a lot better than the east or west or south-facing thermal hubs. So you can get these areas that have pools of water or maybe even running springs and things like that tend to crop up in your north-facing thermal hubs. So north-facing thermal hubs during that early season time frame can be a really dynamite location to kind of hunt around. Again, you're not wanting to push up in the bottom of these north-facing thermal hubs. That's a no-no. It didn't matter what time of year. There's only a certain situation that you can be down in the bottom of the thermal hub and try to hunt it. As far as the timing for deer using north-facing thermal hubs, a lot of times they stage up in these north-facing thermal hubs when it's really hot all during the day. So you're liable to jump a buck or a doe or something like that in these north-facing thermal hubs at any time that you're working up into these thermal hubs, these north-facing thermal hubs, especially if it's hot weather. So I don't hunt up in the head of these north-facing thermal hubs at all. It's just something I just don't do. You're going to have that thermal pull pulling down all the way to the bottom to the tail of that thermal hub uh, all day a lot of times in these north-facing thermal hubs. So if you're in that head area of that thermal hub, your scent can be dispersed all the way down that thermal hub, all the way to the bottom um, a lot of times. So I just don't hunt anywhere in that head unless I'm getting a north wind. If I've got a north wind that's overpowering those thermals, I'll hunt in those link areas up in that head of that thermal hub, but I'm not going to get down in that thermal hub. But north wind strong enough up on the higher ridge points, up on those link areas uh, during that time period. Early season can be really good because you got deer that are flipping from one thermal hub to the other. So I like those link areas with a north wind in that early season when it's still warm weather. If you can get a frontal passage that turns that wind around from the west to the north or something like that, I'm going to look for those link areas between that north facing thermal hub and other thermal hubs, and I'm going to hunt around those areas with that north wind. And that's the only time I'll hunt the north facing thermal hubs. Anytime I can get a wind switch and it's coming out of the north, I'm going to look for those link areas. I may throw a hunt or two in those areas, but aside from that, I'm not going to fool with hunting a north facing thermal hub. Now we're going to move over to a south facing thermal hub. And I call these thermal hubs boom or bust because you're either going to hit it trying to hunt one, or you're going to absolutely bomb it out trying to hunt one. And there's really not any in between. South facing thermal hub, they just do not have the consistency with thermal switches, with their thermal switch enough to determine a time period that's proper to hunt a thermal hub that's facing the south. They are more wind oriented than anything. So south-facing thermal hubs have specific times they can be hunted and under specific conditions. Is what I have found with my trail camera data and my anecdotal hunting experience. If you've got a south-facing thermal hub and you have colder temperatures and you have a north wind, you can see a lot of activity in a south-facing thermal hub. Especially if you have those colder temperatures that are unusually cold. Early season, really hard cold snaps can generate a lot of movement within a south-facing thermal hub, especially with that north wind. You'll get a lot of cruising up and down the sides of these south-facing thermal hubs, and a lot of bedding in areas where deer are trying to thermoregulate. So if you got open areas on these south-facing thermal hubs and you got really cold temperatures with a north wind, you want to look for those areas to kind of highlight to try to hunt off of. Again, I don't recommend ever getting down and trying to hunt in the bottom of these south-facing thermal hubs. It's just too fickle. They're more apt to have rising thermals and really high swirling wind counts in these areas. So I'm hunting up on the ridges, up on the higher elevation around these south-facing thermal hubs with a north wind and with a really abnormally cold temperature. If it's really abnormally cold and I can find me a south-facing thermal hub that's got a lot of thick cover around it, I'm going to be in that area, especially with that north wind. So it's a very specific time frame, very specific conditions to hunt these these south-facing thermal hubs. Thank you for watching. Go hit that subscribe button. If you have any questions, holler at me on Instagram or Facebook. I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this, and I'll be putting out another video next week. Thanks, guys.